If the 1940s, the war years, were the most turbulent for the world, that distinction inside the United States belonged to the 1960s. Never was so much progress made, landmark laws passed and enforced to win equality for black Americans. Yet, in ensuing years, their neighborhoods in 30 cities went up in flames. Never before was it so easy to get a college education. A few decades earlier, only 1 million youths made it to college. In the 1960s, nearly 8 million did. But students went on a multi-year rampage against the Vietnam War and a lot of other dislikes that weren't clearly stated. We enjoyed the highest prosperity of the century and in the world. We defused a serious threat of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We landed on the moon. Yet two presidents who presided over the wonders of that decade came to tragic ends, and the third would later have to resign in disgrace. Why all the turbulence? No better answer has been found than the strange effects of too much, too fast. Population had more than doubled in a few decades. Technology was setting a fierce pace of change that made too many people in the world's most successful nation worried about they weren't sure what. But for all its turbulence, the decade opened on a nation calm and rather pleased at the prospect of new faces in places of power.
We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats.
The 60s began with the United States searching for a new leader. It was the young and vibrant John F. Kennedy against the seasoned Vice President Richard Nixon. For the first time in history, politics was not the main issue.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
With the very first nationally televised debate, style became just as important as substance.
The debate was carried on radio and on television, and the people who listened on the radio, they thought that Nixon had won the debate because they were just hearing the issues. The people who watched on television thought Jack Kennedy had won because they saw how the two candidates looked, and they responded more to Kennedy's image.
When the record number of 68 million votes were counted, Richard Nixon lost the presidential race by the narrow margin of less than 120,000 votes.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
At 43, John F. Kennedy had become the first Roman Catholic to hold the office.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
The charismatic Kennedy stimulated a burst of national enthusiasm, particularly with the young baby boomer generation.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
To have the president stand up and tell the world we're going to do this, it really committed us to not only to doing it, but it provided us with international backing to do it.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
In response to Kennedy's challenge, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. The first phase of Project Mercury was a complete success.
And I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
Meanwhile, big movie hits were winning the hearts of millions. In 1960, Billy Wilder's bittersweet comedy, The Apartment, won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
Did you hear what I said, Miss Kubelik? I absolutely adore you.
Shut up and deal.
In 1961, West Side Story also went on to receive the Oscar for Best Picture. As the world applauded the success of movie entertainment, it mourned the loss of a movie star. Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Jean Baker in 1926, died on the evening of August 5, 1962. To this day, the circumstances surrounding Marilyn's death remain controversial. In many ways, the biggest star of the early 60s wasn't on the silver screen. Jacqueline Kennedy had captivated the world. Her beauty and individual style would carry her into the hearts of men and women alike. With Kennedy at the helm and Jackie by his side, America resembled the mythical kingdom of Camelot. Yet even Camelot had its problems. However, it was the British who created the quintessential Cold War super spy.
Who are you?
My name is Bond. James Bond.
In 1962, the world was introduced to James Bond in the film Dr. No. Sean Connery was the first to portray Secret Agent 007 in the series created by former real-life British secret agent Ian Fleming. Despite the fun and games, America had serious domestic business to attend to. For the first time since the Civil War, America was forced to confront the issue of racial equality head-on. In 1963, President Kennedy had proposed legislation for a comprehensive Civil Rights Act to Congress, but there seemed little hope it would pass. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., a powerful and eloquent speaker, came forward as the recognized spokesman of the Civil Rights Movement, which would unite black and white Americans in marches and nonviolent protests across the country. The focal point of the protests came on August 28, 1963. More than 200,000 peaceful demonstrators filled Washington, making it the largest protest in the history of the Capitol. The Civil Rights Movement was soon overshadowed by a tragedy in Dallas, Texas, which stunned the world and shook America to its core. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Kennedy, his wife Jacqueline, and Governor John B. Connally, Jr. were riding in the same car in a motorcade through the streets of downtown Dallas. At 12:30 p.m., rifle shots were fired. The president was killed almost instantly, and Governor Connally was seriously wounded. A 24-year-old Dallas resident named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the shooting. In a strange twist of fate, Oswald was then murdered by nightclub owner Jack Ruby as millions watched it unfold on live television.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
Life came to a halt during the 4 days leading up to Kennedy's funeral on Monday, November 25, 1963. Attended by numerous world leaders, it was televised worldwide.
Television really didn't explode onto the scene as far as a milestone in news until John F. Kennedy's assassination. And there were 2 days of live coverage of the president's assassination, funeral, that really helped the country pull together and cope with the assassination in a way that it had never been able to do before.
America's youth was left adrift in the wake of John F. Kennedy's tragic death, yearning for a new sensation to fill the emptiness. Young people embraced the sights and sounds emanating from a host of British rock and roll bands. This new sensation became known as the British Invasion and was fronted by 4 young men from Liverpool who called themselves the Beatles. A new phenomenon known as Beatlemania swept the world. The Beatles' first tour aroused worldwide mob adulation. Their concerts were scenes of mass hysteria, and their records sold in the millions. London's The Rolling Stones also hit it big in 1964. Their scruffy appearance and blatant sexual candor differentiated them from the Beatles. Their interpretation of American rhythm and blues helped define the rock and roll sound for generations to come.
Oh, nobody knows the trouble I've seen.
In 1964, the fight for racial equality was far from over. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took up the civil rights cause as a mandate from President Kennedy. After one of the longest debates in congressional history, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2, 1964.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
Despite the chaos in the nation's cities, NASA was pushing the new frontier even further. The success of Project Mercury prompted NASA to initiate Phase 2 of its program, Project Gemini, in 1965.
The Gemini program was the transition between the Mercury program and the more sophisticated Apollo spacecraft that were designed specifically to go to the moon and to make a landing. And there were various things that we really needed to learn how to do. We needed to be able to do controlled re-entry so that we could get back to a predetermined spot on the Earth. We needed to do rendezvous to intercept another spacecraft because that was necessary to do around the moon for the lander to intercept the command module. We needed to be able to do long-duration flights with 2 astronauts up to maybe 2 weeks, and we needed to do spacewalks or extravehicular activity.
The 60s also produced important innovations many today take for granted. 2 of the biggest, microwave ovens and silicon chips. Surfing, dancing, and cars were all the rage. Young people were hanging 10, doing the twist, or racing their muscle cars as the Beach Boys filled the airwaves with their distinctive music. The Ford Motor Company first introduced its classic Mustang in 1964. What did it cost to become the proud owner of a new car? With a wage earner's median income at $7,000, the average car cost hovered around $3,000. And the gas that powered it was 31 cents a gallon.
Throughout the decade, Hollywood continued to award the Best Picture Oscar to mainstream musicals. My Fair Lady, the film musical version of George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1964. The 1965 winner, The Sound of Music, broke box office records. It played in some theaters for more than a full year. Speaking of sound, music, and movies, Elvis Presley continued his worldwide fame in the 1960s with his string of successful movies. They were enormously successful and attended faithfully by his legions of fans all over the world. While Elvis was making hit movies, Bob Dylan was writing hit songs. Dylan began his musical career in the early 60s as a folk singer and songwriter, and soon became a voice of new consciousness among youth. In 1965, the American military presence in Vietnam had greatly increased, contrary to the expectations of most Americans.
Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend, and I intend to keep that promise.
In the 1950s and early 1960s, American military officers were sent to South Vietnam to train Vietnamese troops and advise them on military strategy for their war against the communist Viet Cong in the north. By late 1961, over 16,000 American military advisors were stationed in South Vietnam, and over the coming years, that number would only increase. The Vietnam War proved to be a very divisive issue, leading to protests, peace marches, and demonstrations throughout the United States. Detractors felt America had no business supporting the problems of another country, while supporters argued that the spread of communism must be stopped. Instead of a war between North and South Vietnam, it became a war of the ideals of communism versus capitalism. The 60s witnessed many breakthroughs in medicine and science. In December of 1967, the first human heart transplant operation was performed by Dr. Christian Barnard at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. The laser was introduced and provided surgeons with an invaluable tool for delicate surgical procedures. An oral vaccine for polio was administered, along with other vaccines for measles, rubella, and spinal meningitis. Librium and Valium were the first tranquilizers introduced into the market in the early 60s, and doctors began prescribing them freely without realizing their addictive attributes. The 1960s was also an innovative era for the arts. Pop art icon Andy Warhol exploited the artistic value of commercialism, while artist Peter Max epitomized late 60s psychedelia with his vibrant style. Authors Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, Tom Wolfe, and many others explored the many social concerns plaguing society. New styles and fashion surfaced, personified by modeling sensation Twiggy. Mod style with its flashy colors and prints, miniskirts, standard. The newer the design, the more bizarre. The more and high boots set the standard. The more bizarre, the better. The hippie scene flowered in 1967 with the Summer of Love in San Francisco. The age of Aquarius arrived, and society swarmed with a new breed of youth calling themselves hippies. Their eclectic appearance, peace symbols, and flowers defined their attitudes. Free love, rock music, and drug experimentation was an escape from the domestic and international turmoil that was tearing apart the nation. The rebellion against the establishment and status quo was growing, paving the way for other movements to surface. By the summer of '69, the youth hippie movement had reached its high. The gathering at Woodstock has been described as the culminating event of the counterculture in America. It was a rock music festival held on a dairy farm in Woodstock, New York in August of 1969.
Owned by Joe Cock Country, Joe Crosby, Stills, Nash, Richie, Jimi Hendrix, John Sebastian, Shania Sly, and the Family Stone, The Who.
Attracted by the presence of the most famous performers of the time, a crowd of 500,000 fans camped in a meadow and for 3 days lived in a heady atmosphere of amplified music, drugs, and togetherness.
The vehicle starting to pressurize and all is still low. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight.
The biggest event of 1969 and possibly modern history took place in July.
10, 9, ignition sequence start.
On July 20th, the lunar module landed on the Mare Tranquillitatis, or Sea of Tranquility.
Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
On the surface of the moon, it occurred to me, walking there for a very brief moment, we're further away than two guys have ever been before. But I know there are more people paying attention to us at this very moment than have ever paid attention to two people, two human beings before in the whole history of the world. And that's quite an awesome realization to know that you're out there pioneering something walking around on lunar dust trying to figure out what do I do next, and you got all these people watching you or thinking or paying attention to your every movement, your every statement.